Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, The Medieval Reader. So Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse is doing a year-long series on mortality in literature and film. And after he posted his most recent video about a book that he's been reading on death and killing actually at war, that really inspired me to think about mortality in medieval texts, especially because I personally like thinking about life and death and these big questions. And what came to mind was my favorite sermon by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. So Saint Bernard was a 12th century Cistercian monk, and he's quite a complicated figure. He preached the Second Crusades, he formed the Knights Templar, so he was a preacher of holy war. He was also a reformer of monasticism in the 12th century. He also gave some of the most beautiful, earthy sermons about Jesus, about love, and he was also a guy with a really short temper. So there are things I like about him and there's things that I don't. But one of the things I have been very much moved by is his 26th sermon in his sermon series on the Song of Songs. So at the monastery at Clairvaux, he gave a series of 86 sermons on the Song of Songs. Now these are all allegorical readings of this book in the Bible. The Song of Songs, if you've ever read it, is highly erotic. It's about erotic love. But traditionally, at least in the Western Christian tradition, I think in the East as well, perhaps also in the Jewish tradition, it has been read as an allegory about God, about God's relationship with Israel, God's relationship with the church, Jesus' relationship with the sinner. But in his 26th sermon, which was supposed to be on the 4th verse of chapter 1 of the Song of Songs. So he gave 26 sermons on 25 sermons on the first 3 verses of the first chapter of the Song of Songs, which I think is insane. But in his 26th sermon, he was beginning on the 4th verse. He spent about a page and a half talking about this verse and how it relates to death in particular, which inspired him to talk about the recent death of his biological brother, Gerard. Gerard was a cellarer at the monastery. Cellarer was responsible for the day-to-day upkeep of the monastery. He oversaw the work that masons and blacksmiths and farmers did in the lands surrounding the monastery. He also just made sure that the administrative work was being done in a timely fashion, which allowed Bernard to go off and give his sermons and spend time in prayer and focus on his spiritual life. So Gerard was really important in Bernard's life, and therefore it was incredibly hard for him to deal with his brother's death. Because Bernard was the abbot of Clairvaux, he was the one who gave the funeral mass for his brother. He was the one who buried his brother. And so, at this time, monasticism is very, very strict. There's strict fasting. There's a lot. It's quite stoic. There's a lot of emphasis on not being affected by the world and giving up worldliness. And so emotion was seen as very worldly, unless it was spiritual. So Bernard actually is quite an emotional person when he talks about his spiritual life, but he, in a lot of his other sermons, talks about distancing yourself from the world. During the funeral mass, he gave that kind of sermon, and he didn't cry, and he basically, pretended that this was just another day. But of course it wasn't, and that's what Bernard says in his 26th sermon on the Song of Songs, that the death of his brother has really hit him hard, and he cries openly in front of his brothers. Now, Bernard ascribes to a theology that isn't so popular anymore. He believed that because of original sin, death was a punishment, and that humans deserve this punishment, again, because of original sin, which humans are born with. So Bernard, on the one hand, acknowledges that the death of Gerard is due to original sin. He doesn't say that it's his brother's sin. It's rather Bernard who is being afflicted by God by taking away his brother. And so he says, I know I deserve this. This is my punishment. But, he says, I am human, and I weep because I loved my brother. He was my companion. He helped me around the monastery. He helped my spiritual life. He was my best friend. At one point, he even wonders whether Gerard, now that he's in heaven, cares about humanity, cares about Bernard, and prays for him. Here's what he says. It is possible that though you once knew us according to the flesh, you now no longer know us. And because you have entered into the power of the Lord, you will be mindful of his righteousness alone, forgetful of ours. Furthermore, he who is united to the Lord becomes one spirit with him, his whole being somehow changed into a movement of divine love. He no longer has the power to experience or relish anything but God, and what God himself experiences and relishes, because he is filled with God. But then he says, no, he knows that Gerard is still thinking of him. He says, but God is love, and the deeper one's union with God, the more full one is of love. Your love has not been diminished, but only changed. When you were clothed with God, you did not divest yourself of concern for us, for God is certainly concerned about us. All that smacks of weakness you have cast away, but not what pertains to love. And since love never comes to an end, you will not forget me forever. At the end of the sermon, Bernard addresses the criticism that some of the other monks may have had, that weeping is a sign of a lack of faith. And Bernard says, no, it's a sign of humanity. Jesus wept when his friend Lazarus died. David wept when his son, who was actually trying to kill his father, Absalom, was killed. So weeping is a sign of humanity, and trying to suppress emotion is just falsehood. It's lying. It's lying to oneself. It's lying to God. It's lying to other people. It's only human to be able to acknowledge the loss. Here's what Bernard says about Gerard. My soul cleaved to his. We were of one mind, and it was this, not blood relationship, that joined us as one. That he was my blood brother certainly mattered, but our spiritual affinity, our similar outlooks and harmony of temperaments drew us more closer still. We were of one heart and one soul. The sword pierced both my soul and his, and cutting them apart, placed one in heaven, but abandoned the other in the mire. I am that unhappy portion, prostrate in the mud, mutilated by the loss of its nobler part, and shall people say to me, do not weep? My very heart is torn from me, and shall it be said to me, try not to feel it? But I do feel it intensely in spite of myself, because my strength is not the strength of stones, nor is my flesh of bronze. I feel it and go on grieving, my pain is ever with me. He who chastises me will never be able to accuse me of hardness and insensibility like those of whom it was said, you have struck them, they have not felt it. I have made public the depth of my affliction. I make no attempt to deny it. Will you say then that this is carnal? That it is human? Yes, since I am a man. So yeah, this sermon is very beautiful, and it's one that I revisit every time someone I know dies. It's just a reminder that even the most austere monk experiences emotions. And I just thought to mention this. I hope to make more videos this year talking about mortality in medieval literature. I could also mention Augustine and his reactions to the death of his mother. There is certainly evidence in this sermon that Bernard was familiar with Augustine's relationship to his mother Monica, but that's for another video. I would want to make a completely separate video about Monica, especially because it was late 4th century. Is that Middle Ages? No, it's late antiquity, so that's for another time. So yeah, that's my video for today. I hope you found this interesting. You can definitely access the sermon online for free. I will link it below. Thank you everybody for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.